So in the last lecture, I explained that the styles we apply to our components here are scoped to this component. So they will not leak outside the template for this component. But how does that work? Well, before we get there, we need to look at the concept of shadow DOM. If you have never heard of shadow DOM before, it's basically a specification that enables DOM tree and style encapsulation. Simply put, it allows us to apply scoped styles to elements without bleeding out to the outer world. Now, this is kind of a new feature in browsers. Not all browsers out there support this. In fact, as far as I know, it's only supported in Safari 10 and higher, or Chrome 53 or higher. Now, let me show you shadow DOM in action. Look at this piece of code here. You have seen something like this before, right? So this is plain old JavaScript. We're not talking about Angular. We use document and the query selector method to get a reference to an element in our HTML document, okay? So we have this element, and then we can use the inner HTML property to set its inner HTML. Now here we have a simple h1 to display hello, and above that we have this style, which changes the color of our heading to red. Now the problem with this implementation is that this style leaks outside this element. So if I have another h1 somewhere else, that's going to be red as well, but I don't want that. Now, if you're building a component and you're going to apply some styles to your component, you want to make sure those styles are only scoped to your component. Or let's say you want to use a component built by someone else. They might have defined some styles on their component. When you bring that component into your application, you don't want those styles to overwrite the styles in your application. So that's where shadow DOM shines. We can change this code and use shadow DOM with only one extra line of code. So after we get a reference to this element, we simply call l.createShadowRoot. And this gives us the root of shadow DOM for that element. Then instead of using the inner HTML property of the element, we use the inner HTML property of the shadow root. That's all. And with this, our h1 style will be scoped only to this element. It will not leak outside this element. So this is shadow DOM. Now you might ask, what does this have to do with Angular? Well, back in our favorite component, here we have this concept called View Encapsulation. So in the component metadata, we have another property called encapsulation. And we set this to the value of View Encapsulation enumeration. So View Encapsulation. This is an enum that is defined in Angular core. So look, View Encapsulation is defined in Angular/core. Now, this enum has three members: emulated, which is the default value, native, and none. Now, for the most part, you're going to use emulated. You're not going to change this setting. But I'm explaining how this works so you have a better understanding of Angular framework. Now, with this mode, Angular emulates shadow DOM. So it understands that most browsers out there don't support shadow DOM, so it has its own trick to apply scope to our styles. Let's see how that works. So back in the browser, here's our red icon. Let's inspect this. Now, in the head section, we have 4 style elements. The first one is bootstrap. You can see that here. The second one includes all the global styles we define in styles.css. So earlier I defined 20 pixel padding on our body element. The third one is an empty style element. Now look at the fourth one. Let me zoom in so you can see more clearly. Looks familiar, right? So here we have our glyph icon class, but Angular has attached an attribute here, ngContent-c1. And inside this rule, we have color set to red. Now, what is this? Well, if you look at what we have in the DOM, so this is our favorite element, which is the host element for our favorite component. This is our span, where we have the glyph icon class. You can see that attribute applied to this element as well, ngContent-c1. So Angular attaches an attribute to our elements and uses that attribute to post-process our CSS rules. And this way, this red color will only be applied to an element that has the glyph icon class as well as this attribute, ngContent-c1. Now, if you look anywhere else in this document, you won't see this attribute. For example, here we have another span, which is for rendering the user icon. But the attribute here is ngContent-C0. Now, you don't ever have to worry about these attributes. They're generated automatically at runtime. We're not going to code against them. They're purely for Angular to do its job. And this is the emulated view encapsulation, which is the default encapsulation mode. So Angular tries to emulate the concept of shadow DOM. Now, the second value we have here is native. And with this, instead of generating these attributes dynamically, Angular uses the native shadow DOM in the browser. And of course, this is not going to work in most browsers out there. It's only supported by Chrome version 53 or higher and Safari version 10 or higher. But let's see how this works. So save. Back in the browser. First, you can see our red icon, our red favorite icon disappeared. I will explain why this happened later. So for now, let's just right-click it and inspect it. Now, once again, look at the head section. So we have 3 style tags. The first one is Bootstrap. The second one is the global styles. The third one is the empty one. We don't have the fourth style element where we had our post-process CSS rule. Now, if you scroll down, here's our favorite icon. Look, under that, we have this shadow root. If you don't see this, you need to go to the settings of Chrome Developer Tools. Scroll down. Under Elements, make sure to tick Show User Agent Shadow DOM. Okay? Now, under Shadow Root, we have this style element, and our glyph icon class is applied here. So it doesn't have that additional attribute. Now, why did our icon disappear? Because the only styles applied to this element is the red color. So none of the styles defined in Bootstrap are applied to this element. And that's why we don't see the actual icon. Now, if you want to really bring Bootstrap stuff here, you need to do something like this. So we go to favorite.component.css. On the top, we're going to import Bootstrap. We can simply go to styles.css and copy this import statement into our favorite.component.css file. Now back in the browser, now we have our red star icon. Let's inspect this. So here's our favorite element. Under that, we have shadow root. Look at this style element. We've got Bootstrap here. So all the styles defined in Bootstrap ended up under this element. And as you can imagine, this is going to create performance problems down the road. So you shouldn't really do what I showed you. I just wanted to explain why our icon disappeared. It was because of the scope that is applied to this element as a result of using shadow DOM. So back here, I'm going to remove this line. Now let's go to our favorite component. So this was native view encapsulation, which uses shadow DOM in the browser. And finally, we have none, which basically means here we're not going to have view encapsulation. So the styles defined here will leak outside this template. In other words, when we go back to the browser, both our icons are going to be red. Let's see. There you go. So obviously, you don't want to use this. So here's the lesson. The default view encapsulation is emulated, which emulates the shadow DOM, and it works by attaching additional attributes to our CSS rules. Now, for 99.9% of the cases, you don't want to change this. I just explained what this is all about. So if you read some documents on the web and you come across the term view encapsulation, you know what's happening under the hood. So don't even bother with this property.